and welcome to another edition of SDN TV News. I'm Leischen Stelter, editor of Security Director News, and we are here on the second day of ASIS International in Dallas. Today I'm joined by Lawrence Loesch. He is Vice President and General Manager of AlliedBarton. Thanks so much for sitting down with me. I appreciate it.
Good morning, Leischen. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of your history and background, actually. You said 30 years as a law enforcement officer.
Yes, I worked in the New York City Police Department, started in 1968, and 30 years later, in 1998, I left. I left as the Chief of Detectives for the Borough of Queens.
Mm-hmm. So you've actually had a really interesting career in terms of spanning both the public sector as well as the private. And, you know, I think it's a really interesting topic and something a lot of security professionals are interested in is making that transition, basically, from the public sector to the private sector. And I was wondering if you could just give us a little perspective on what that transition was like for you.
Sure, that's an interesting thing. It's a good question because it's very difficult for some people to make that transition. For those who make it, it's very rewarding on the other side. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. There's a lot to learn when you leave law enforcement and come to the private sector. There's new issues, new surroundings, new cultures. And some of the best things to do is education. What I did, the first thing I did when I first got out was I went for my CPP certification my first year. And that was not only to show my peers, my new peers, that I'm part of the crowd, but also for my own mindset change. And once you get through that mindset change, I think it's a big plus for you. So I think an education that way should be done by most law enforcement people who are going to make the transition to the public sector, private sector.
Mm-hmm. And so you went from being a law enforcement officer. What was your next step? Did you go directly into corporate security?
Yes, my first step from there was to go to Payne Webber. At the time it was Payne Webber, later UBS Payne Webber. I became the global head of security for them. Then I switched over to Credit Suisse First Boston with the same position as a global head of security. And then 8 years ago, I switched to AlliedBarton, and I run the New York City operation of AlliedBarton. I have about 5,000 employees, security officers, and I cover the 5 boroughs in Long Island.
So you've obviously had a very long career in law enforcement and security. What are the changes that you have seen in terms of the way that law enforcement and the private sector work together? Have you seen that it's progressed in its coordination?
I think progression is a great word, and it's quantum leaps. It's not just small progression. It's made great steps since 9/11. I think that was the big turning point. It forced people to recognize that there are two differences there. That's when the world started talking about 85% of the infrastructure in this country is owned by the by the private sector. So now there's a realization that both of these have to work together. There have been great strides. I think there's still a lot more to do. There's a couple of organizations out there, and I could talk a little bit about New York City, what strides they've made, but there's plenty more to do.
Actually, could you give us an example of what New York City has led a lot of security initiatives, and I know that there's one in particular that you think's made, an impressive step. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The first organization that the police department had was called Apple, APPL. Today it's SHIELD, and SHIELD is an organization run by actually the police commissioner, and all the private sector, there's probably 1,000 plus members, I don't know what the numbers are today, all of the security directors in New York City who will be invited to these meetings, monthly meetings. It's the liaison between both of those, and it's made great strides to work together because neither one could do this alone. We're all in this together. Many of the people in the private sector are prior law enforcement. And I think that's helped. That's helped to bring about the transition and understanding that there is a different role for each one. But the things I talked about in New York City. SHIELD is the newest organization. There was a meeting recently, and it's a debriefing on counterterrorism and things like that. And the police commissioner himself is involved. So what happens with that is the principals come. The actual security directors are not sending someone else to these meetings. So because it's the principals, I think we're making great strides. The newest initiative is called the Lower Manhattan Security Initiative, and now the Midtown Manhattan Security Initiative. This initiative is actually taking the cameras from the private sector and giving access to them to the police department. Literally thousands of cameras in Manhattan are now being viewed by people sitting in a room, both law enforcement and private. I'm allowed to, and corporations are allowed to put people in that room during the day to monitor these cameras. So we all have access to this, not only to let's say, to resolve or solve problems, but also to be preventive in our activity and proactive.
And in your perspective, you had mentioned that there's still a long way to go. Do you think that it's just through these continued initiatives of collaboration, or do you think there needs to be any kind of change in mentality, one side or the other?
I think it's a combination of things. The key, though, is training. I really, really think the key is training and working together. Tabletop exercises, which is doing more and more taking place, those type of things, to understand that each one has a role. There are not enough police officers out there to get everything done throughout this country. So the private security has so many people, so many sets of eyes and ears out there. Even if they're just good at observation and passing on to the police, and the police do their role, we each have a different role. But in reality, from my perspective, the average security officer is a first responder because they're already there. They're on the site. They're in the building. Both the International Association of Chiefs of Police and ASIS International are working closely together. They have their law enforcement council. They have their private sector liaison council, and they're working together and collaborating on doing different training programs, best practices, things like that. So I think this is going to be this is the wave of the future, and we need more and more of that working together.
I think that's a good message to really do some of that joint training and really building that respect for each other. I think is really an important step. Well, thank you, Lawrence, for sitting down with me. I really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your show here.
Thanks, Leischen. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. This is Leischen Stelter signing off from SDN TV News.